Hello, everyone, and welcome to the York Festival of Ideas 2024 for our session, The End of Empires and a World Remade. We're delighted to have you. I'd like to introduce myself first as my name is Dr. Gerard McCann. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of History at the University of York, a historian of East Africa and its global connections. I'm delighted to welcome you to this session. I'd like to introduce our speaker, who is joining us from the University of Exeter. Professor Martin Thomas, a professor of imperial history and the director of the Centre of Histories of Violence and Conflict at the University of Exeter. A widely and celebrated scholar of the field, a fellow of the Leverhulme Trust, the Independent Social Research Foundation. He's the author of many works, which you can find on his departmental website, including the books Violence and Colonial Order, Police Workers and Protest in European Colonial Empires, and Fight or Flight, Britain, France, and the Roads from Empire. But today we're here to celebrate and hear about his book, recently published, The End of Empires and a World Remade, A Global History of Decolonisation, a mammoth and hugely important book that has just come out, in which he tells us the story of decolonisation and its intrinsic link to globalisation. And in this talk, and indeed in this voluminous book, Martin will trace the connections between these two transformative processes: the end of formal empire, the acceleration of global integration, market reorganisation, cultural exchange, and migration. And he explains how decolonisation stands alongside the Great Wars as the most transformative events of the 20th century. So without further ado, Martin, thank you so much for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Gerard. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to be here. I'll talk a little bit about the book and what really animated me in writing it, I suppose. In order to do that, there are certain really basic points that it's perhaps worth starting with. So you can see, I hope, in front of you a copy of the book's cover. At the bottom of that cover, you've got a picture of Algerian refugees. And they are actually on the border between Algeria and Morocco in the summer of 1962, at the point that the war between France and Algeria formally came to an end. And those refugees are about to head back into Algeria. With them would come the insurgent group, the leaders of the national movement, the Front de Libération Nationale, the FLN, that ostensibly, the history books tell us, defeated the French and would take over what was soon to become a one-party state in Algeria. But of course, like the refugees, those senior figures in this movement, the FLN, had actually been outside Algeria for much of the war. And so one of the points that the book cover, I suppose, is hinting at or trying to convey is the idea that the end of empire and decolonisation more broadly was something that was much more global in its configuration, not simply a matter of battles or struggles between particular imperial countries and their dependent societies or colonies. And in order to explain that process, I suppose I tried to go back to the start of the 20th century. Here's quite a famous image from the end of the First World War, produced by a very irritated delegation to the Weimar Republic, which of course was facing the fact that at the end of the First World War, the Allied powers were about to deny Germany control of its colonial empire in supposedly the name of furthering self-determination, this great new concept, or at least this great new rhetorical idea, which many people equated at the time and since with national freedom. And the essence of the propaganda poster that you're looking at is saying, well, what would happen if the Allied powers took the idea of self-determination seriously and let go of their own colonial reigns? And of course, the poster is supposed to suggest that, well, here we have a supreme act of hypocrisy. Imperial countries, colonial powers telling another one that it's bad, whereas they are good. And of course, that empire still has a place in this world in which self-determination or ideas of national freedom can still be pursued. In other words, there's a tension. There's always been a tension between empire and freedom, but that tension is really crystallized, I think, by the outcome of the First World War and by this idea that certain territories deserve or could legitimately claim national status, nationhood as it's sometimes called, while certain others would still require foreign occupation, to put it bluntly, imperial tutelage as it's described at the time. The other point, of course, that global map makes pretty obvious is that at this point in the early 1920s, and indeed right down until the 1970s, empires really were everywhere. Colonial control is not, in other words, something that is unusual. It may be unethical, it may be immoral, it may be in many, many ways repugnant, but the one thing it is not is unusual. And social scientists tend to describe that in terms of what they describe as normativity. Empire, in other words, was regarded as normal. So in some ways, the book is really an effort to explain how we shift that normativity, how empires cease to become normal and become not only unusual, but unacceptable. And of course, at the heart of that is the idea of peoples struggling for their own freedom. Here is a pretty famous image from the early 1970s supporting the struggle of the Angolan people to be free of Portuguese colonial rule. And if one looks at the very small print, which I don't recommend because it's not easy on the eyes, but the small print is advocating support for the leading nationalist movement in Angola at the time, the Marxist. Again, studying that propaganda poster a little bit more closely, we can see some pretty familiar and again, global tropes or sort of stereotypes almost. One in the foreground is, of course, the image of the female freedom fighter clutching not only her child, but a weapon in hand, and of course, embodying ideas of an Angolan nation about to discover itself and fulfill its cultural authenticity. The text is also rather significant in that this is not actually a poster produced by Angolans themselves. For one thing, as is obvious, it's in English. It was actually produced in Canada, but by a London-based left-wing Marxist organization, now long since defunct, the IMG, but which, in a sense, again, embodied that idea of global connections, of people around the world taking up individual fights for anti-colonialism, for the end of empire. I've put the little caption at the bottom there, meanings of decolonization, because of course, in a way, until perhaps really the early 2000s, as an academic, when one would present an image like that, it was really regarded as almost self-evident. Here was a picture of a particular national group struggling to be free of a particular empire. This was a story that could be told almost bilaterally in terms of what was happening in Angola, in terms of what was happening in Portugal, and one needed to understand the interactions between the two. In a way, the discipline of history and I think sort of more general understandings of empire have moved on quite a lot since then. Because as that poster, as I've described it, rather shows, involvement in decolonization struggles was far more international, or to use a little bit of jargon, transnational. It operated below the level of governments. It brought together different groups, civil society actors, non-governmental organizations, pressure groups, supranational organizations like the United Nations. Increasingly, decolonization, in other words, was something that meant a global process. However, more recently still, ideas of decolonization in, if one can call it that, the sort of popular mind, have changed again. Increasingly, decolonization is described in terms of its central objective, which is to end racial discrimination, which is to end forms of government, forms of political, economic, and cultural control that posit that one ethnic group is somehow different, somehow better than another. And of course, that idea, which I think is clearly morally repugnant, that idea is now seen in the popular mind more in terms of the persistence of racism in societies that are nominally decolonized, whether that be within Europe, within North America, or across what is commonly described as the global South, the former colonial world of Africa, Asia, and much of Latin America. So for many, decolonization is described in terms of the need, for instance, to reform institutions that are described as institutionally somehow racist, whether they be institutions of government, institutions of the law, the security forces, the police, or indeed public bodies like museums, artistic organizations and outlets that in many respects still retain colonial links that it is argued by many need to be decolonized. So the book, in a sense, is in a way looking back to meaning of decolonization, and while addressing these questions of discrimination and racism at its heart, is nonetheless saying, well, what about empires and how they ended? That used to be what decolonization was commonly understood as being, and that still helps us to understand why institutions, organizations, societies, if you like, in a post-colonial world have yet to be decolonized. Well, one way to explain that is by looking at a basic question that has long interested more political scientists and social scientists, I'd suggest, than historians. And that is the question, well, why did these empires collapse? Why, if they were so overwhelmingly powerful, militarily, economically, industrially, why were various anti-colonial movements, many of them based in agricultural societies and with minimal resources at their disposal, why were they able to win? How, in other words, did the weak, understood as anti-colonialists, defeat the militarily strong? Well, one answer to that lies in what I've described here as global insurgent connections. This is a kind of who's who of the senior leaderships of some of the major anti-colonial movements of the 1950s and 1960s. I won't go through the numbers exhaustively, but you might see there in more or less the center of the picture, number 15, that is Nelson Mandela. To his left, to our right, number 5 is Ahmed Ben Bella, the first president of Algeria. There are various other senior figures here that I won't describe in detail. But the point is, they are working together. And they are working together in opposition, not just to the individual empire that controls their particular territory, but in opposition to colonialism as a whole. And it's that mobilization, if you like, of global connections between those who would describe themselves as anti-colonialists, many of them leading armed movements fighting against empires, that will change the dynamic of decolonization, increasingly so after the Second World War, and even more so as we move into the 1950s, the 1960s, and beyond. Well, some people aren't convinced by that argument, and this is another point that I address in the book. And some people say, well, to focus on those insurgent connections, to focus on the way in which anti-colonialists work together is part of the way of explaining decolonization, but it can only be a part because at root, there is something more fundamental still. And that is the point that the world understood as global audiences of people like yourselves interested and involved in political processes, the world really wakes up to what empire means. Here is an image from December 1948. The figure on the right is a member of the British Colonial Special Branch in Malaya. In the background, you might see British Gurkhas conducting a search, and in the foreground are two Chinese tin working laborers in a tin mining encampment in Peninsular Malaya at the start of what was commonly called the Malayan Emergency. Well, we don't know whether this picture was staged or not. It rather looks as if it might have been, but the dynamic at its heart is pretty clear. At the beginning of the Malayan Emergency, there were a large number of killings by British colonial security forces of, in particular, Chinese laborers, many of whom were supposedly shot while trying to escape. And one can only imagine just how frightened those two individuals in the foreground were. The point of showing you the image is that it's quite an unusual one in that it is unapologetically showing what we might describe as a human rights abuse in progress. And increasingly, it is that ability of those opposing empire to say, well, it is intrinsically abusive because it is founded on ideas of ethnic difference and racial discrimination that leads more and more people, not just within colonies themselves, but within Britain, France, within the home states, if you like, of imperial powers, and across the world more generally, to say, look, empire has had its day. And that process is commonly described as moral disarmament. More and more people around the world are unwilling to tolerate an international system in which empires persist. So for some then, the story of decolonization is in a sense a happy one. It's one of a world that is coming to see that empire, colonialism, systems of institutional and international racial discrimination can no longer be tolerated. That's, again, part of the explanation, one might say. But another thing that the book addresses and puts at the center is an emerging competition between those who used to run empires, those who are trying to take over what will become independent states, and others across the world more generally who want a part in helping those societies emerging from empire to develop, to increase their economic potential and to improve the living standards and the survival chances of their populations. And that struggle is commonly described in terms of development competition, in terms of those, whether they be imperial powers themselves, like the British, the French, the Portuguese, and others, whether they be anti-colonial movements, like that Algerian Front de Libération Nationale I mentioned earlier. That's the group that is depicted in this particular image, or whether they be others perhaps better known to us as an audience, like the African National Congress in South Africa, earlier the Indian National Congress, and others across South and Southeast Asia. All of them are very keen developers. All of them, in other words, see a future in which independent countries, in order to establish themselves, in order to make the lives of their people better, must somehow focus on really core indices of what academics might call biopolitics, what we would more commonly, I think, understand as living standards and life opportunities. So here you see a female member of the FLN, clearly serving as a medical attendant and nurse, conducting a basic health check on an Algerian child. The argument being presented to you in this image is that the Algerians themselves are better able to serve the interests of what's still an overwhelmingly rural population than the French. But of course, the French, as the colonial power, are at the same time saying, oh no, you're not. The French still have a place in Algeria because they have more money to invest in schools, medical clinics, housing, etc., etc. And so that is just one illustration of what plays out across the decolonizing world as competition for development intensifies, and in many respects becomes one of the principal forum in which the decolonization process unfolds. Moving on chronologically a little bit, yet other people who analyze decolonization, and there are an awful lot of them, what some of those individuals and academics suggest is that, well, all of that stuff I've just been describing is all very well, but really decolonization hits its stride only in the very late 1950s and on through what some have described as the long 1960s. Not actually a decade, but in practice, a period of about 15 years that begins with the revolution in Cuba, the triumph of Fidel Castro's communists in the spring of 1959, and that will more or less come to an end with the oil crisis and the Yom Kippur War of 1973, and the failure of something I'll go on to describe, the new international economic order, the NIEO, in the following year, in 1974. Well, if that's true, the central claim is that decolonization is really made more radical by a sort of global revolutionary shift that begins in Latin America, that extends through Africa and Southeast Asia, and that is typified by conflicts such as the Vietnam War, depicted here, other conflicts across Southeast Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa, like that war in Angola that I was describing earlier on, which won't end until 1974. There's a lot to be said for that argument, that, if you like, the more radical what's described as third worldism, in other words, a global rising, really, of the formerly colonized parts of the global south. There's a lot to the argument that pressure from below, pressure from the global south, really does intensify and make a cataclysmic difference only from the 1950s onwards, and particularly so in the 1960s. One of the key bits of evidence that tends to support that view, I suppose, is the changing configuration of the United Nations. We see, for instance, that by 1960, the United Nations is avowedly committed to support self-determination and indeed armed struggles to achieve self-determination, or put in other terms, decolonization. And we see also that the UN General Assembly in particular is far more dominated by countries, territories of the global south, ipso facto, as decolonization proceeds and more colonial territories become independent nations and supporters of the decolonization of other places. The big argument against that view, though, is, well, captured, I think, by this image. Here we see a famous conference in 1974 that launched this concept, and indeed really a new coalition of countries who united under the banner of the new international economic order, the NIEO. I'm afraid they've given themselves a slightly different title, the new just world economic order there, but really it's the same thing. Their argument being that economic decolonization has still to be achieved in the 1970s. Yes, by the middle of that decade, there are very few formal colonial empires intact. There are lots of pockets of colonial territory, particularly island territories spread across the Pacific, Indian Oceans, and elsewhere. But most of the big oceanic empires and land empires have gone. The problem, of course, that the supporters of this NIEO identified was that newly independent countries were expected to fit within a pre-existing international system and within a pre-existing structure of global trade that was overwhelmingly dominated by the big industrial powers of both the capitalist world and indeed what was described at the time as the communist second world. Both of them, in other words, still expected newly independent states across much of the global south to provide them, especially with cheap primary products, oil, foodstuffs, metals, the kind of, if you like, building blocks on which industrial economies sustain their own prosperity, but which condemned many of the newly independent states to what some of their leaders described as a neo-colonial future, a future in which they were effectively economically hobbled because they could not conduct trade on their own terms. And so the NIEO was an effort to say, look, there must be a reconfiguration of global trade, an economic decolonization to match the political one. The problem, of course, is that many people have forgotten the NIEO now because it didn't succeed. It would very quickly be rejected by most of the industrial powers of the global north, the wealthy countries, if you like, of what we might describe as the rich world. Trade would not be reconfigured in a more egalitarian manner, and instead we are about to enter the era of what's sometimes described as structural adjustment. Others describe it as neoliberalism, free market capitalism, in other words, in which decolonized states are expected to fit. And so I'm afraid the book, in a way, ends on a perhaps provocative but a slightly pessimistic note, insofar as it suggests quite strongly that decolonization, for many people, is still unachieved, and for others has been something of a disappointment. We do not yet live in a world in which the fundamental equality of people under the sun across this planet is recognized as the same. And until that is the case, decolonization cannot be said to be done. So the story really is not yet over. My presentation, however, is. Thank you very, very much for listening.
Hello, Martin. Thank you so much for that tour de force, that journey through this important and much anticipated book. We have just under half an hour for questions, which are coming in on the Q&A function. Please, if you have any questions or comments even, please enter them there and we'll try and get through as many as we can. I've got many questions myself, but I shall go straight into questions from our guests. I won't use in the interest of anonymity, I won't use people's names who've asked the questions. And of course, this presentation and indeed the answers will be available online via the York Festival Ideas YouTube site. The first question that we've had in, Martin, is, I guess, about perhaps layered sovereignty might be the $10 way to put it, is a question about to what extent ethnic-based separatist movements can be attributed to the forces of decolonization that you've described so eloquently.
Thanks, Gerard. That's a very nice question to begin with. I suppose, in a way, one of the most obvious indicators that decolonization isn't done is that for an awful lot of people across nominally decolonized or independent countries, freedom has yet to be achieved. One thinks, for instance, of Myanmar at the moment, in which there are numerous armed groups fighting to achieve not just ethnic separatism, but what they would describe as freedom from state-run oppression. Numerous other groups are in a similar position. And of course, those who are sometimes described as members of a fourth world, indigenous First Nation groups across particularly territories in which there was a high degree of settler colonialism. One thinks, for example, of North America. You might also think of territories across the Pacific. Peoples, in other words, who find themselves subsumed or ignored within a decolonization story that is often told and is often achieved simply in terms of the freedom, if you like, of the dominant ethnic majority. So the question, I suppose, really poses the challenge of, well, how do you protect minority ethnicities within a decolonization process that, if you like, tends to sanctify the idea of the nation state, of a single large territory, as being the only way forward. So one of the things we see, of course, after numerous decolonizations, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, are the outbreaks of secessionist conflicts, sometimes civil wars, led by ethnic groups that claim, well, okay, Nigeria might be decolonized, but what about us, the Igbo of Biafra of southeastern Nigeria? We haven't got freedom within this state. We still face, in effect, being dominated by ethnic groups other than our own. One could make a similar argument in relation, for instance, to the creation of Bangladesh in 1971, a territory that would only achieve a kind of national freedom once the peoples of Bengal, particularly East Bengal, were able to free themselves from the rule of what at the time was both East and West Pakistan. So my answer is really simply to say that, well, this is further proof, really, that decolonization is not just a massive global process, but an unfinished one. And it's one that, in a sense, is constrained by, if you like, the unwritten rules that many of the anti-colonial movements that fought for it tend to follow themselves. Anti-colonial movements that would tend to suggest that there must be a nation state, and a nation state that nominally could accommodate minorities, but which in practice sometimes find that they struggle to do so fairly.
Thank you very much. That idea of decolonization as an unfinished process really is the kernel of this book. So it's really nice to have that at the forefront of your answer. I have a couple of questions about that unfinished business that come from one of our esteemed guests. The first one is asking for your opinions, really. Your opinion about former imperial powers making economic reparations to former colonies. And a linked question is from the same person is your opinion on decolonization being taught as part of the GCSE curriculum in this country.
Thank you. That first question about reparations is one that I get a lot, particularly as the book dwells quite substantially on ideas of, if you like, political economy. In other words, it takes seriously the idea that, well, perhaps we've concentrated a bit too much on the politics of decolonization and sometimes on the cultural sort of aspects of colonial discrimination. And we haven't really tended to look at some of those harder economic questions that actually figure larger in daily lives. It's all very well to achieve independence, but what happens if you're still chronically poor, if you're indebted, if you have no access to land, if it's very, very difficult to find a way out of the poverty trap? Well, one obvious answer to that would be to say, well, isn't it time that the rich world, the global north more generally, redistributed some of its wealth? And one way to do that might be to pay reparations for all those decades, centuries of colonial maltreatment, going back, of course, most strikingly to slavery. I am quite strongly in sympathy with that view. The problem, of course, is even if that view were to be taken seriously by Western governments as a proposition, which I'm afraid at the moment it is not, but even if it were, setting the level of reparations is likely to be a very protracted process. So insofar as the book is really an argument about equality and its absence, on the one hand, I'm strongly in sympathy with the idea of reparations, but on the other hand, to be honest, I think a more effective way of redistributing wealth and helping those at the bottom of the global poverty chain is to reconfigure the way in which we make globalization work, the way in which, in other words, the global system of trade operates. And I think that is something that those supporters of the NIEO were arguing in the 1970s, and I think they were right, and those who opposed them were wrong. As regards teaching decolonization as part of the GCSE curriculum, yes, I'm all for it. I don't really support the idea of nationally configured school curricula, whichever country we are describing. I think the more we are able to teach children from the earliest point possible that they are part of a planetary citizenship, that they are just another person within a world society rather than a citizen of a particular nation, the better. So if decolonisation being taught at schools, even in a very simple way, in terms of some very basic ideas about fairness, were to be introduced, then yes, please.
Here. Quite a question that I think you're considering your past work as well as this book, be uniquely placed to answer. This comes from one of our another guest. What role did the global wars of the 20th century, in your opinion, including the Cold War, play in your global history of decolonisation?
Yeah, thank you. That's another great question. I mean, I suppose I started that presentation, didn't I, with the aftermath of the Great War, or as a lot of people now call it, the Greater War, because it does sort of leak on into the 1920s. It doesn't really end, at least globally, nice and neatly in 1918. I do see that First World War as transformative because in some ways, it does change the way in which the international order works. That's a rather abstract way of describing something pretty simple, which is that governments around the world start questioning what it is to have an empire, and whether or not an empire is something that is not just politically and morally defensible, but is kind of economically and culturally sustainable. And one of the expressions of that, for instance, is what is done with those German territories with which I began that presentation, because of course they are taken away from German control, but they are not rendered independent. Cameroonians, Namibians and others do not acquire national independence, freedom, after the end of the German Empire. Instead, they find themselves, if you like, arbitrarily reassigned to other supposedly better colonial countries. But of course, they do so as part of what's described as the mandate system. And the mandate system, of which perhaps the most famous territory of all is Palestine, a territory that whose past and troubled history of colonial intrusion we know is still very much with it to this day. Palestine as a mandate and others are supposedly only to remain parts of an empire temporarily. They are, in other words, supposed at some future date, the date is never precisely defined, but they are supposed at some future date to take on their own self-government. And that's quite a big shift. That idea that empire is contingent, and it's not just contingent in itself, but it's contingent on the quality of the colonial government that is offered to the people living under it. That does change the rules a bit. The Second World War changes things even more. Of course, it's an even bigger conflict. It leads inexorably to the growth in American power, the growth in the power of a communist world. Countries that, while they have very much colonial pasts of their own, are not naturally sympathetic to the continuation of those big European overseas empires, of which the British Empire is the largest. And of course, that ambiguity, in some cases, that opposition to empire, expresses itself in part through the Cold War, through different ideological choices about the future of this decolonizing world. That being said, one of the things that my book suggests, and I suppose I would say this because I'm a historian of empire, is that actually the Cold War is secondary to decolonization, rather than decolonization just being another sort of sideshow in this global Cold War. That's something I don't think is correct. I think, if anything, the dynamic is one in which decolonization tends to figure much larger for many, many more people than Cold War.
Thank you very much. We're going to move to a slightly different scale of question, a more an epistemological one that speaks more to the first bit of your book. And this is from one of our guests. About your thoughts on a distinction that some scholars make between decolonization and decoloniality.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. That goes back to some of the comments I was trying to explain it in the presentation earlier on about changing meanings of decolonisation. The term is now increasingly used as part of a sentence that will typically end with decolonize the museum, or decolonize the police, or decolonize the university that you or I work in. Yes, decolonize our minds. Think beyond racial types, racial others. Think, in other words, of all people as being genuinely, authentically equal. It's an idea, this sort of reconfiguration of decolonisation, as something about the persistence of racism in contemporary societies. It's an idea that really took off, I think, with what's often described as post-colonial scholarship, which did not originate primarily among historians, but rather more among scholars of literature, scholars indeed, as Gerard would know very well, of South Asia, scholars who, in other words, were principally preoccupied with the persistence of colonial thinking, of colonial attitudes, of colonial mindsets, of a world in which, for example, histories could still be written that substantially ignored most of the people living across the colonial world. Histories that substantially ignored huge numbers of people, such as women, children, the elderly, the poorest, the most marginalized socially or culturally within colonial societies, until, in other words, we get to a point of genuine inclusiveness, then that decoloniality is not authentically achieved. And so there is, I think, a distinction to be made between decolonization and decoloniality. And I suppose what I'm trying to suggest is that part of the reason for the incompleteness of decolonization is that around the world, we are still in a situation in which colonialist mindsets, if one can use that term, are, I'm afraid, all too common.
Great, thank you very much. Another question that's come in, which is dealt with in the book with skill, is about the Soviet Union. And we've talked a lot about European empire. One of our guests wants to know a bit more about your opinions on the importance of the USSR's military supplies and other tied to anti-colonial movements in the mid to late 20th century.
Yes, thanks. That's another really, really interesting question. One of the people who read this book before it was published and sort of made suggestions about how it might be changed said, well, don't you need to talk a lot about the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Here is something that is pretty clearly imperialistic. Here is a society and a state, at least, that is trying to reimpose some form of imperial rule. Well, the Russian Federation under Vladimir Putin, of course, is very different to the Soviet Union that preceded it, but they do share something at root, which is that both are in many ways imperial, both are a form of empire. The Soviet Union, of course, not just a union of socialist republics, but in effect a union in which European Russia tended to dominate its other component socialist republics. That is relevant in the Cold War because the USSR, while commonly seen, I think, as being one of the big supporters of anti-colonial movements, and indeed, yes, a big supplier of weapons and money to groups like that Algerian Liberation Front, to the Vietnamese National Liberation Front led by Ho Chi Minh, to multiple others, the Angolan MPLA that I was talking about earlier. All of them receive large quantities of help from the Soviet Union. But at the same time, the Soviet Union could be construed rather differently as, in some ways, just as imperialistic as the Western powers that it decried. In other words, its support for anti-colonialism is less a matter of authentic support for global equality, if you like, and more a matter of geopolitics, more a matter of national advantage, more a matter of furthering Russian influence and economic power globally, just as the United States and others are doing as well. So to pick up on that example I used earlier of so-called competitive developmentalism, the Soviet Union becomes one of the biggest backers of large-scale development projects in the colonial world. And of course, Soviet advisors, Soviet engineers, Soviet agronomists, etc., will be found throughout much of the global South, supposedly assisting decolonizing countries to achieve authentic independence, but very often implanting Russian influence, Soviet influence more deeply.
Thank you, Martin. One of our guests thanks you for your excellent talk, and notes the somewhat pessimistic tone with which the book finishes. And this person would like to know, are there any success stories you might like to highlight? And what are the measures that might bring about successful decolonization, inverted commas?
Thank you. Yeah, in a sense, that gets to the crux of things. Please don't take my pessimism too far. A world without empires, even if it's not a world wholly without colonialism, but a world without empires, I would suggest, is better than a world with one. So in that sense, I am happier, more optimistic about the 21st century than about much of the 20th. The sadness really comes from the fact that decolonization doesn't quite fulfill its promise. And I suppose to answer that question about successful decolonizations, we need to think again about this idea of political economy, about people's ordinary day-to-day economic existence. Most of the people across the decolonizing world live in rural societies. Yes, there are large, often mega cities within those societies, but still large numbers and often a large majority of the population within those countries are engaged in agriculture. The most obvious example of successful decolonization, I would suggest, are in societies where the structure and the practices of farming, of agriculture, of the opportunity to own, farm, and improve the lives of one's family through doing so are taken most seriously. That's a long-winded way of saying something quite simple. Decolonization is perhaps best measured by whether or not it was followed by land reform. And in a lot of countries, it was. Vietnam is one instance, India is another. Now, one can argue that in both cases, there are enormous limitations and huge flaws. Sometimes those land reforms are very vertically imposed, top down by government, not really through much consultation with the people they're going to affect most. But even so, the recognition that it is in enabling poor people to improve the quality of their lives through managing their own opportunities more sustainably, that is where decolonizations, I think, have gone furthest and most successfully so.
Thank you, Martin. We're almost out of time. I thought a good way to bring the session to a close would be to read a quotation from the book that really speaks to what this talk has been about and what the book's about. And it's from the very beginning of the book. I quote, "For most of those affected by opposing empire was more visceral than ideological. The constraints of rights and opportunities was part of something bigger, the restriction of freedom to move, to associate, to own certain things, to practice one's own culture." And what I'd say that this book in particular strength is, as well as covering the big geopolitical events and processes and institutions that Martin has, is getting down to that kind of visceral level of everyday colonialism, of violence, of resistance, of heroism. And I would strongly encourage you all to buy this this wonderful book, which also, as well as being incredibly well written, it's also incredibly well researched. I'll hold up the book. One half is the prose, one half is the notes and the bibliography. This is a superb distillation of cutting edge scholarship on decolonisation, and I'd like to thank Martin for his time and encourage you all to buy the book from the partner bookshop, Fox Lane Books of the York Festival Ideas, and again, once again, to thank Martin for a very illuminating and very powerful talk. Thank you very much, everyone, and please do rewatch again on YouTube once that's available through the York Festival Ideas website. Thank you.
Thank you.